March 1945. A small gray village near Koblenz, Germany. The air is thick with the scent of damp stone and spent gunpowder. Smoke rises from a chimney where a combat cook prepares a victory meal. Dozens of German soldiers sit in the mud of the town square, their hands laced behind their heads. They are defeated, disarmed, and waiting. In the center of the square, an American officer stands with a clipboard, meticulously recording names, ranks, and serial numbers. He ignores the silent woods to the east. He ignores the worried glances of his junior officers who watch the tree line. To him, the paperwork is the priority. He believes the battle ended the moment the last German dropped his rifle. He is wrong. This is the moment a commander chose bureaucracy over a perimeter, a decision that General George S. Patton would answer with a lesson in the lethal cost of misplaced priorities. This is the story of what happens when arrogance writes the orders, leading a commander to prioritize the ledger over his lines and losing everything in the process. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happens when old hierarchies met new realities. These are the forgotten moments that shaped the course of the war and defined the men who fought it. Second Lieutenant James Burke was 24 years old and hailed from the coal country of Scranton, Pennsylvania. He served in an infantry company that had clawed its way through the hedgerows and across the Rhine. Burke was a man of quiet competence, shaped by a childhood where a single mistake in the mines could mean a collapsed ceiling and a slow death. He had learned early that survival was a matter of sequences. You did the dangerous work first, so that you lived long enough to do the easy work later. He had lost his older brother at Kasserine Pass, a tragedy that taught him that the German army was never more dangerous than when it appeared to be retreating. To Burke, every silent ridge was a sniper's nest, and every thicket was a hidden panzer. He stood in the muddy street of the village, his rifle slung but his hand never far from the grip, watching the dark trees and feeling the hair on his neck stand up. In sharp contrast stood Captain Allen Rhodes, 32 years old and originally from a wealthy enclave in Baltimore, Maryland. Rhodes viewed the war through a lens of rigid, academic legality. Before the draft, he had been a rising star in a prestigious law firm, and he carried that clerk's soul into the cockpit of combat. Rhodes was a man of unearned privilege and pristine appearances. Even after days in the field, his boots remained polished to a mirror shine, and his field jacket looked as though it had just come from a tailor on Pennsylvania Avenue. He believed that the chaos of war could be tamed by the strict application of international law. To Rhodes, the Geneva Convention was not just a set of rules, it was a shield that protected his moral standing. He often remarked to his fellow officers that the hallmark of a civilized army was how it handled its captives, regardless of the tactical situation. He was more concerned with the accuracy of his prisoner manifest than the placement of his machine gun teams. He saw 40 captured Germans not as a security risk, but as a logistical task to be completed with professional precision. Holding his clipboard like a scepter, Rhodes had decided that the war stopped while he finished his paperwork. By March 1945, the Third Army was moving with a speed that defied traditional military doctrine. The German front was no longer a solid wall. It was a shattered mirror, with fragments of disciplined units and desperate stragglers scattered across the Rhineland. Koblenz sat at the confluence of the Rhine and Moselle rivers, a vital geographic hinge that the Germans were desperate to keep oiled with blood. The Allied advance had become a series of rapid-fire seizures. Units would bounce from one village to the next, clearing houses in the morning and expecting to hold them by noon. In this environment, the transition from offensive momentum to defensive stability was the most dangerous moment of the day. The chaos of the German retreat created a false sense of security among some officers. Because the enemy was fleeing, many assumed they had lost the will to fight. They forgot that a cornered animal is the most likely to bite. Across the European theater, seasoned colonels often allowed their men a moment of respite after a capture, but the standing order was always the same. Dig in first, rest later. Some commanders had begun to treat the final weeks of the war as a foregone conclusion, focusing more on the administration of the occupation than the realities of the front line. They grew lax with their scouts and heavy with their paperwork. They saw the thousands of surrendering Wehrmacht soldiers as a burden to be managed, rather than a combatant force that could be rallied. In the hills surrounding the Moselle, The Germans were watching these lapses with hungry eyes. They looked for the gaps in the line where the Americans were too busy with their victory to notice the counterattack forming in the mist. The village was quiet, the prisoners were lined up, and the gap in the eastern approach was wide enough to drive a panzer through. Lieutenant Burke walked toward the center of the square, his boots crunching on the broken glass of the village street. He stopped beside the table Rhodes had requisitioned from a nearby cottage. The captain was leaning over a stack of forms, checking off names as a line of Germans shuffled past. Burke cleared his throat, but Rhodes did not look up. "Captain, the scouts are reporting movement in the trees about 800 yards out on the eastern road," Burke said. "We need to get the machine gun teams into those 2 stone houses at the edge of town. We are completely open on that flank." Rhodes sighed and adjusted his glasses, his eyes never leaving the paper. "Lieutenant, we have 40 men to process and only a limited amount of daylight to get them to the rear." My orders were clear. Every man not currently on a direct guard detail is to assist with the cataloging and the escort. Burke stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Sir, half the company is occupied with these prisoners. If a platoon-sized force hits us from that ridge, we won't have the numbers to hold the line while managing a crowd of captives. It's a tactical nightmare. Establish the perimeter first, and we can count heads once the sun goes down." Rhodes finally looked up, his expression one of cold, academic disdain. "You're thinking like a brawler, Burke, not an officer of the United States Army. The Geneva Convention is very specific about the humane and efficient processing of prisoners of war. It is a legal obligation that defines us as a civilized nation. The perimeter can wait 20 minutes until this batch is cleared." Burke shook his head. "The Germans won't check the rule book before they open fire. Sir, we are sitting ducks." Rhodes stood up straight, smoothing the front of his spotless jacket. "That is enough, Lieutenant. I am the commanding officer here. I will not have my men behaving like savages who ignore the law the moment a fight ends. Every man stays on prisoner detail until this manifest is finished." "That is an order." Burke looked at the empty windows of the eastern houses and then at the complacent captain. He knew further argument was useless. He walked back to his men and told them to keep their eyes on the trees. The report of the negligence and the refusal to secure the ground moved up the radio net, reaching the ears of a man who valued the lives of his soldiers far more than the neatness of a ledger. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep roared into the village square like a thunderclap, skidding to a halt just feet from the processing table. Dust and grit sprayed over Captain Rhodes's pristine paperwork. The general did not wait for his driver to open the door. He stepped out, the 4 stars on his helmet catching the thin March sun, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting at his hips. Every soldier in the square snapped to attention, the air suddenly freezing in their lungs. Patton did not look at the buildings or the scenery. He looked directly at the clipboard in the captain's hand. He walked forward, his pace measured and heavy, and stopped within inches of Rhodes's face. "Captain, what is the current status of your eastern perimeter?" Patton asked, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. Rhodes swallowed hard, his face pale against the backdrop of the mud. "General, we are currently finishing the processing of 40 enemy combatants to ensure full compliance with the Geneva Convention. My men are finalizing the manifest before shifting to defensive positions." Patton stared at him for a long beat, his eyes narrow. "How many men do you have under your command at this moment, Captain?" Rhodes straightened his jacket instinctively. "I have a full company, sir, though half are currently detailed to prisoner security and escort." "And how many of those men were holding rifles when the Germans hit that eastern approach an hour ago?" Patton asked. Rhodes hesitated, his voice trembling. "Only a skeleton crew, sir, as the paperwork required." Patton cut him off. "So you traded 12 American lives for 40 names on a piece of paper?" Rhodes tried to find his voice, his eyes darting to the prisoners. "The law requires us to treat them humanely from the moment of capture, General. I believed it was my duty to ensure no protocols were breached." Patton leaned in closer. "You thought your duty was to a desk. You believed that the enemy would wait for you to finish your bookkeeping. You took a village, and then you handed it back because you were too arrogant to listen to the ground under your feet. You saw 40 prisoners as a legal exercise, rather than a tactical threat. You left a hole in the line because you wanted to be a clerk instead of a commander. 12 men are dead, because you like the sound of your own virtue more than the sound of a secured perimeter. You have two choices, Captain. You can stand here and explain your legal theories to the burial detail, or you can surrender your bars right now. You are relieved of command. You will not lead another man in this army, because a man who counts his chickens while the fox is in the coop is a butcher, not a soldier. Secure the ground first, or you don't deserve to stand on it. Rhodes stood silent, his clipboard falling into the mud. He had no answer left. Patton's order was executed with the speed of a falling axe. Under the watchful eyes of the entire company and the 40 German prisoners, Captain Rhodes was stripped of his authority in the very square where he had prioritized his ledger over his men. A sergeant was ordered to collect every clipboard, every fountain pen, and every unfinished manifest from the processing table. These papers, the symbols of Rhodes's misplaced obsession, were piled into a small heap in the center of the road. Patton watched in silence as a soldier struck a match and set the stack ablaze. The orange flames consumed the names and serial numbers that Rhodes had valued more than the lives of his scouts. As the smoke drifted toward the eastern tree line, the men of the company were ordered into the positions they should have occupied. Hours ago, they hauled machine guns into the upper floors of the stone houses and dug foxholes into the frozen earth. Rhodes was forced to watch this frantic fortification from the back of an open truck, standing where every man he had failed could see him. There was no dignity left in his polished boots. The Germans, who had been sitting comfortably in the mud, were now herded toward the rear by a skeleton crew, their processing abandoned for the sake of the perimeter. The village was finally a fortress, but the cost remained etched in the 12 empty beds and the 8 empty seats on the trucks heading home. James Burke returned to Scranton after the war and spent 40 years working in the management of the very coal mines he had escaped as a young man. He never forgot the silence of that eastern approach or the 12 friends he lost because a superior was too busy with a clipboard to listen to a warning. He was a quiet man who became a pillar of his local VFW, though he rarely spoke of the medals he earned or the village near Koblenz. He died in 1988, surrounded by grandchildren who knew him only as a gentle grandfather, never realizing he was the soldier who had stood his ground when the world was falling apart. Alan Rhodes did not fare as well. After being relieved by Patton, he was reassigned to a rear echelon administrative post in England, where his penchant for paperwork was finally put to a use that didn't cost lives. He returned to Baltimore in 1946 and resumed his legal career, but the shadow of his relief followed him through the quiet halls of his firm. He became a bitter man, often writing long, unpublished letters to the War Department, complaining about the lack of procedural discipline in the Third Army. He died in 1972, still convinced that he had been a martyr to the rule of law rather than a victim of his own tactical incompetence. Patton never mentioned the incident in his public memoirs, but a single entry in his private diary from that week noted that a commander who cannot distinguish between a legal duty and a tactical necessity is a danger to his own flag. He believed that the lives of his men were the only currency that mattered in the ledger of war. He once told an aide that a dead soldier cannot uphold the Geneva Convention, and a lost battle cannot be won with a well-formatted report. For Patton, the sequence of survival was the only law that could not be broken. Some historians argue that Captain Rhodes was technically following the letter of the law, and that his commitment to international treaties was a noble, if poorly timed, attempt to maintain American moral superiority during the chaos of the German collapse. They suggest that the fog of war makes every tactical decision a gamble, and that Rhodes simply prioritized the long-term legal standing of his nation over immediate security. Others argue that his actions were a gross dereliction of duty, representing a dangerous form of hubris that traded the lives of his own men for the sake of a personal moral ego. They contend that a commander's primary legal and moral obligation is the protection of those under his command. What is certain is that the loss of life at the village became a case study in the harsh reality of combat priorities, proving that even the most humanitarian rules cannot be applied effectively if the ground they are written on is lost to the enemy. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply issued a formal reprimand instead of a public relief? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happens when arrogance writes the orders, Make sure to subscribe.